What are registration rights associated with preferred shares? Well, generally, this is simply the ability to force or take part in. Demand means to force, piggyback means to go along with or take part in an SEC registration of a particular class of shares of ownership of the corporation. Now, why is this necessary? So an investor invests money in a startup venture and may not be able to immediately sell or trade those shares because those shares are restricted. That is, pursuant to the exemptions from the securities regulation regime, Rule 144 of the SEC regulations says that you have to hold those shares for a particular period of time if it's going to comply with the exemption from registration, because companies generally do not want to register the securities, which allows them to openly sell the securities to the public. So they perfect an exemption, and this exemption requires holding on to the shares, so the shares are restricted for a period of time. Now, investors, because of this, lack liquidity. They cannot cash out or sell their shares. So registration rights of a preferred shareholder says that the preferred shareholder can either force registration, that is, make the company register a class of shares so that they are now liquid and can sell those on the public market, or that if another class of share is being registered, such as the common shares are being registered, then the preferred shareholder can participate in that or piggyback on that, either through conversion of the shares into common shares or likewise cause a registration of this other class of shares. So that's demand and piggyback registration, but it all amounts to effectuating a registration of the shares to add liquidity for the preferred shareholder. Now, there are numerous provisions associated with the registration rights, and these are generally to outline the requirements for registration and to limit the extent or more definitively explain what is expected as part of the registration. So registration usually begins with filing a Form S1 or Form S3 depending on the situation and complexity of the venture. How many shares are being registered? Are all classes of shares out there being registered, both preferred and common shares? So there'll be provisions pertaining to that. Are you registering multiple classes or just one class and the number within each class? When is the registration going to happen? Does it happen within a certain time period of purchase? How long should it be, or the holding period should be after registration? What is the value of the registration? What are you listing the price as? That as part of the registration process, you're making disclosures to the SEC. So you're projecting the pricing at which you are going to sell or open up this class of shares for sale on the public market. Because oftentimes the initial public offering process sets an initial price, and they go through investment banks to distribute those shares initially, and then the secondary market is established around that. So the company has a lot of ability to set the registration price up front. So who covers the expenses of registration? The registration process can be extraordinarily expensive. Particularly if you have a very complex registration or it's a very large registration that requires involvement of a whole team of investment bankers and white collar legal services that are extremely expensive as part of the process. So there's that. And then what is going to be the lockup period after registration? How long does the preferred shareholder continue to have to hold the shares after the registration process before they can be publicly sold? Oftentimes this lockup process is generally applicable to new purchasers of shares pursuant to the IPO, and thus the same lockup period is applicable to existing shareholders. That causes them to maintain their ownership interests. Termination, when do these registration rights terminate? Well, they can't continue forever. Obviously, after an IPO, they're no longer necessary. Also, if the time period or holding period for the class of preferred shares has already come and gone, you've held the shares generally 12 months or more, you're no longer going to run afoul of those exemptions from registration. So that makes it where these registration rights are superfluous. So oftentimes they'll go away at that point. And then there'll be best efforts provisions in there that would basically state that the company uses its best efforts in carrying out the registration process, and that the investor facilitates that process. So it's a best effort standard on both sides that'll be included in there. So this is an overview of registration rights of preferred shareholders and how it's generally used in startup ventures.